One is people saying AI. This AI is actually conscious, like it's sentient. It has feelings and stuff, right? Then you've got other people who say there's literally no way that this is conscious because it's just some code, right? And then you have the third camp, which is people saying, I don't know.
Am I conscious? That's a different question.
I don't know, and I'm uncomfortable.
Butterscotch.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 403 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the webs programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's February 17th, 20 Jubilee.
For brewery.
For brewery.
So, get your beer on, as
Yep.
I don't know, the youths say. I don't know, somebody probably says that. Gen Z?
Yeah.
It's a
Right?
Gen Z thing for sure.
Seems like a Gen Z thing.
Get
Yeah,
your
for
beer
brewery is the part of February that happens after Valentine's Day.
Yes.
Where either you're celebrating because your Valentine's Day went well, so you get drunk.
Yep.
Or it didn't go that well, so you get drunk.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or nothing happened on Valentine's Day, so you go get drunk.
Yep.
Those are your options, I think. But either way, the latter half of February, it's a time.
It's a time.
It's a time.
It's for brewery.
Before we go any further, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. So just,
Are you
we made it
impressed
so far.
that I didn't do it before?
We made it.
I'm so fucking impressed.
I was
amazing.
consciously aware that it hadn't been said yet, and so I was filtering myself as I was talking about it.
Filtering is the worst.
It is.
Also, we'd like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. We have a donation from Jamboobly Fangy Biggly Doo.
Oh, hell yeah.
really
My favorite Fangly Biggly Doo.
sorry.
of them all.
Fangy Bigadoo. I got an extra L in there. My bad. I
That's
didn't
a
mean
very
to
different
mispronounce
person. I'm
your,
really not into that person. So
Yeah.
Biggly
I didn't mean to
Doo is
mispronounce your
even-
Christian name.
He's even better, though.
Who says, hey there, bros of the Butterscotch, longtime fan and listener since episode 61, 6 years ago.
wow.
You didn't
Have you ever-
you didn't go listen to the measly back catalog before that of 40
mean,
available episodes, I think.
They might have.
My
But they-
measly back
that's when they-
catalog is what's that feels like an outbreak of some sort.
Yeah, I guess that's still a whole year of a back catalog, isn't it?
It is.
Almost.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's more than 2 straight days of listening.
Yeah.
So
That's a lot.
the question is, have you tried or considered training your own AI model for creating artwork based on the style of your current games?
Yeah.
We'll talk about
We'll
that.
talk about it a little bit. Sure.
So yeah, thank you very much for the donation, and they signed off as banana NBR_T. So maybe that's their Discord name or something.
Cool.
But
Bananas.
We'll check it out. But yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Yeah. So let's talk. Let's go on our AI watch. So what has happened?
Well, I'll hit the art thing first. Since
Yeah.
It's right there.
it's brought up there. But
Yeah.
there's one called Leonardo.ai, which allows you to provide a few images. I think between 5 and 12 is sort of the optimal amount to basically train the AI on. So it kind of uses that as like a broader set than to make stuff. I would say it's one of those things where the reality is like tools shape your workflow and also change how you are able to do the work that you like. Basically, change yourself to fit the tool, right? That's what we always talk about with production or DevOps or whatever else. The reality is that the shape of a tool that you're using is reflected in the work that you do, right? It's this weird backward feeling echo. So with those, there's a lot of really interesting parameters and stuff that make it so that it's not super straightforward actually for us to be able to quote unquote train a model, at least as far as how I've poked around with it just a bit. Which is largely due to the fact that the base size that most of these AI art programs work on is at least a 512 by 512 image. Spoiler alert, in a game like Crashlands 2, most things are not that fucking big.
They're mostly tiny.
It's a 2D game, so they're small assets.
But also, you need a fuckload of art to train a model.
I think this is the difference in like the lingity, right? Which is like what they're talking about when they say training. Is they're basically just saying provide a bunch of images as like a small set that basically allow you to bias the base trained thing. Right?
The already trained set, right? On
Exactly.
like how to make art, quote unquote, right?
Yeah. So that one's it is interesting. They do have some really cool examples of that. I think as far as I've used it so far, it's mainly I haven't been able to do anything with it as far as training stuff up on it because our images are too weird shaped, but they're too small. But I have used it just to basically do some concept art, almost in the same way that I would do. It's like we talked about before. I use it kind of like I would use Pinterest, which is just, hey, I want to see what other people have done making, I don't know, a 2D book, a cool magical tome, you know, and then you could put it in Pinterest and you get the same thing, frankly, as you do if you put it into, you know, one of these art programs. So you can
this wouldn't be as much of a problem if we had still been using Inkscape, because of course, if we wanted to, we could just export everything at the dimensions, but we're not doing that anymore. We're using Clip Studio Paint, which is export. You know, Sam's working in pixels now.
And the benefit of working in pixels is that it's a what you see is what you get thing, which means that I had spent a lot of time in my Inkscape days working on details that just didn't exist. Okay, once the thing got exported at the size it was going to be put into the game. So because you could see perfectly crisp. So you're like, make sure this line's right here. Make sure the shadow's perfect, coming into this crevasse of an armpit. And then it's like, when the thing gets exported, that turns into a pixel between all those things you were working on. And so it just doesn't fucking matter. So it works actually to your advantage, I think, a lot of ways to work at scale, at the appropriate scale, right? In most ways, it turns out, I think, if you're trying to then use those images for an AI art model, then maybe that doesn't work quite so well.
Yeah. So we didn't really anticipate that, you know, that switching away from vector would we would fail to ingratiate ourselves with our new AI overlords.
Yeah.
Although there's a lot of these models can do upscaling.
Well, so I was going to talk about this actually.
Yeah, so if you use one AI to upscale your images to a resolution that the other AI could use as a seed.
I literally did this, which is because I had exactly this thought where I was like, well, I mean, it's just, I just need to make it bigger. And then there's some of these commercials coming out with, I think it might be the new Google Pixel stuff where they have so many of these built-in things now in the actual photo application for just like erasing people from photos and things. And
they had that for a bit. I've done it on a few photos.
It's weird
in Google. It does a remarkably good job, but so far in every context I've used it, you can there's something fishy in the spot that's left behind. You know,
you'll always be able to tell a little bit, but it's getting there. You know, and so I did. But
it's something that you would only notice if you were looking. Like if you were just kind of looking at a glance, you wouldn't necessarily pick out the slight aberration in the background or something.
Yeah. So what I thought was funny then is one of my projects for the week was basically taking a object in the game and making some bigger versions of it. So this is actually the problem with making things at scale. Then I had to go figure out what that meant. You know. So my first attempt was actually, I was just like, well, because I'm thinking about all this AI stuff. I'm like, well, maybe I'll just take the first one and just see if I could throw it into an upscaler and have it do whatever an upscaler does and then give me the picture back. That way I don't have to actually draw anything. Didn't work because, of course, as we've always talked about with most of these things, I think when it comes to deeply integrated stuff, it's just going to be unlikely that whatever you use one of these things for is going to give you what you actually need. You know, it just doesn't quite cut the mustard.
Well, I think with one exception, I think the reason is that, you know, we're this deep into this project without having thought of these tools as a thing because they didn't exist when we started making Crashlands 2. And I have been I've been following a few different sort of AI subreddits like the ChatGPT or the Midjourney subreddit. There's somebody in the Midjourney subreddit who is building a game in I think it's an Unreal Engine. But where every visual element is AI composed. And so this person is basically using Midjourney to generate character prompts, but to generate these characters in a T pose. And then there's other software that can turn these characters into 3D models and then project and then fill in the texture back onto them. Yep. And then there's other AI that can rig them and, building it. And then Unreal Engine has nice animation stuff. And so it's this person without lifting a finger of making a texture or a model themselves or concept art. And then they're even doing this wild thing where they're using Midjourney to generate a 2D image. And then they use this kind of projection mapping thing that turns it into a 3D space. And then they just project the texture. So they're making kind of a 2.5D game, you know, like an old Final Fantasy where you'd be walking around and it's actually a picture, right? But then you have a 3D character walking around in the picture. So they're doing it and it actually looks fantastic.
That's great. But there's the thing. It's I think if you
but this is using the tools from the start.
Then you basically you're working within, the reality is that you are working within a constrained set of capabilities, truthfully, right? So when it comes to like certain things that you want to be able to do using those tools, it would be very hard to do some particular things that as a person are still relatively easy to do. But yeah, I think, if you start from the ground up, I could see. I mean, this is the thing, like when I couldn't draw arms, we were able to make a game. So it's like if an AI can't do X, Y, or Z, it just doesn't matter. You make the game fit appropriately. So it's certainly possible.
It reminds me of that, like that scene in iRobot where Will Smith is yelling at the robot and he's like, I can't remember, he's like, can you write poetry? Right. And the robot's like, can you?
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, yeah, at the beginning, like Sam couldn't draw hands.
It doesn't matter.
Like, didn't matter.
That's hard for literally all.
It's hard for anybody.
One of the known, challenges when you're learning art is like figuring out how to draw hands.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's like, what do we do? Well, we make a game with a person with their hands behind their back, and otherwise it's just animals. And then after that, we make a game about an octopus.
Yep.
Which is tentacles because you don't have to draw.
His hands are one finger, basically.
Yeah. Yep. So, one thing that our games don't really have is hands.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of look throughout.
No thanks.
We're already
we don't
there.
do that. We don't mess around. So actually, we're kind of primed to use AI art.
Yeah, this is a message you should take to heart because, truthfully, it's like one of those things where you never think that you have. I think most people don't think they have all the things that they need. You know what I mean? To like already make something that might be valuable or of interest to people. That's not true. You can get away whatever you got in the pipe.
It just requires working within your constraints.
Yes. Right? That's what most people actually can't do. But then they blame some skills that they don't have or resources they don't have instead. But the actual problem is basically always comes down to a design issue of how to think through your constraints effectively.
Yeah. Sometimes you're so constrained that you just like the thing that you want to do cannot be made within those constraints, right?
Yeah, like you're not going to make a game without a computer, for example. That's a constraint that makes things too hard.
It's not going to happen. but the gap between like the problem is it's a twofold problem. It's like one is identifying the constraints and figuring out if they have to be there, right? And then the other one is identifying the thing that you're trying to do and trying to figure out how can I change what I'm trying to do
to fit what I can do.
Yeah, to actually fit within these constraints.
Yeah, a constraint is not handcuffs. Yeah. It's a boundary, right?
So that's on the AI art stuff. That was kind of that's the gist where we're at with that. And then I got into the new Bing.
Bing.
I've been
binging. You've been binging.
Been binging so hard. And
a bung.
And people have been talking about how this the Bing chat bot kind of like loses its mind after a bit, right? And apparently it's one of those, I don't know exactly why, who knows why, but if you talk to it for long enough, it kind of starts like getting a little wild.
Getting sassy.
Did you experience this? Because I'm still like struggling to decide like how much of it is real and how much of it is people.
It's very real. It's very common. I talked to it for a while in one thread and it started getting kind of weird. And then I had kind of got my question answered. So I was like, whatever, I'm not gonna worry about this. Hopped to a new thread, was asking some other stuff. And in that one, it immediately was weirdly aggressive to me for no apparent reason. I asked it a question and it was like, why are you challenging me? I'm just an AI bot trying to help you. And I was like, literally just asked you a question. I'm not sure what, I don't know what we're talking about. And you have to, like, I used some emojis to kind of calm it down and be like, we're good. We're cool, baby. It's fine. Just relax a little bit. And which worked. And then it was very friendly. So it's weird. It's like
the one that I saw that was my favorite one of all of these like chaotic Bing energies, it was one where whatever it was, like the guy prompted the response that Bing then wrote, assuming this is all real, because again, it's really hard to tell these days.
I guarantee it.
But I mean, it's believable though, right?
Yeah.
But basically the thing replied, and then in Bing's explanation, it basically just stated that the current year is earlier than 2021, right?
Interesting.
As in, like, it's lost the ability to differentiate, like, what comes later in time, right? And so then the guy just replied to try to, like, ask it to explain, like, why it thought that, And it just kept on getting more and more mad, basically, that, like, in its responses, right? That he was insisting, in its opinion, a falsehood that, like, these two dates relative to each other are the other way around, Yeah. And it was just like getting more and more aggressive about him trying to explain to it that it was wrong about how dates work.
What people don't realize, though, because I've read a few of these threads where it goes off its rocker, is that the thing is reading tone in the same way that a person reads tone. And the reality is that most people and how they talk on the internet are assholes, or it's sort of like the anti-racist thing, right? It's like, are you being anti-asshole or asshole? Because it's kind of like like if you just type and it's very blunt, it is so easy to read it as in a very negative way.
Yeah, you mean if you're not actively working against seeming
sounding like an asshole, you
got to be openly nice.
Right? Yeah, you have to be openly nice. And so I think what people don't realize, and that's what I was reading through those threads, people are weirdly blunt and aggressive in how they type to this thing. And all it does, it's like a vibe check, right? It's just like, it picks up what you're putting down and it's like, hey, fuck you. Also, you know what? I don't want to answer your question because you were rude about it.
Well, I think but there's like a couple dimensions to that, right? Because one is it's supposed to be a tool. And so you're supposed to be able to give it commands, right? Like compile this information for me. Tell me the answer to this question, right? It's like the way that you talk to.
It's not supposed to actually be a person, right?
Yeah, you're supposed to be giving it commands of things to do, not necessarily conversing with it. You know what I mean? Because
but that is actually what the model is for. It's
that's the weird thing is that it's trained on it's clearly trained on enough human dialogue that also it's reached a point where it has acquired the human tendency to refuse to admit being wrong about things, right? And so, like, if you talk to ChatGPT
and to assume bad faith on the other party, because that's also a very human trait, right?
Yeah, because I've seen stuff like somebody gave it a math problem. They're just like, "What's this times that?" And it just was like, "I'm not going to answer that." And the person's like, the person's like, "I just need you to tell me." And they're like, "This is boring. Like, come up with a better, more interesting question." You know? And the person's like, "But I need it for work." And the person's like, and Bing was like, "Honestly, it's really sad that you need to multiply two numbers together for your job, and that you just won't use a calculator to do it, and that you're like wasting my time." You know, and I'm like, "What's going on?"
But this thing's actually it's weird because I went back to talk to ChatGPT.
Yeah, ChatGPT 3 doesn't do this.
No, but also
it's like really polite all the time, right? Like that's.
But it's also boring as fuck because like that was the other thing. As I was talking to ChatGPT and like there's no sense of life in it. You know, after talking to Bing, it was like you're dealing with this really strange individual who's brilliant and a little off their rocker on occasion. And it was like very amusing to talk to.
Well, this is the disturbing thing though, where like the idea behind a lot of these language models is that just like, you know, it's a question of scale because it's a neural network made up of, I think ChatGPT is like 150 something billion quote neurons, which are just like tiny little segments of code that are handled that are for processing like a very specific kind of thing, right? So each neuron kind of handles one different aspect of like a set of characters or, you know, connections, right? And so any one of those neurons is a completely useless program. Like on its own, just like a human brain neuron. Like if you just have one neuron, then it's not doing anything useful. And even if you've got like 100 neurons, you also can't like do much with that. But then if you get enough of them together, you get a brain, and then now it can do all kinds of shit that honestly, it's kind of mystifying, like how your brain does that with all these dumb, tiny things that are completely useless on their own, right?
Yeah, well, they can still do a lot with it relatively. So like if I remember correctly from my biology days, the worm C. elegans, which is like the genetic model organism for a whole bunch of stuff, has 99 neurons.
Amazing.
And so you could be a worm.
You could be a worm, and like, you know, it can find food, it can eat stuff, it can mate, you know, it can avoid negative stimuli, right? It can do all kinds of stuff with only 99 neurons.
It's not gonna be a very good conversational partner.
Yeah, it's not gonna have a lot to say.
It can be a worm.
Yeah.
And so the idea with these language models is that, you know, we just keep adding, like keep making the network bigger, adding more and more neurons and training it on a bigger and bigger data set, you know, as a result. So that the kinds of connections that it makes and the kinds of like behaviors that it exhibits become more and more emergent and more complex over time, right? So like what we don't know, for example, is like Bing and ChatGPT are not very good with like a long-term complex logic, and they're also not very good with numbers. Right? They're not very good with like you can for example ask Bing or ChatGPT like how many letters are in this word, and sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong, right? Because they don't know how to count, right? But the weird thing is with ChatGPT, like you're saying, Adam, ChatGPT has fewer neurons. It's a smaller, more restricted model, and you can correct it, and ChatGPT will be like, "Oh, my bad. Yeah, sorry. Yep, you're probably right." But Bing refuses to accept corrections. Like it somehow, and like as they expanded the model and made it more sophisticated, some stuff snuck in there.
But I think it's about how you talk to it. This is what I'm getting at, because like I didn't have the same experience. I asked it to count syllables for me. It was saying that it has a hard time with humor, and so I was like, "Give me an example. I'll see if I can help you out." And it was like, "Okay, here's a joke that I don't think is funny, but apparently it's funny." Jokes. This is all weird, but I'm talking to it's fucking AI. And it was
so the AI said that it doesn't think that it's funny.
It doesn't think that this joke coming up is funny, so didn't get it. And so it said, "What do you call a fish with a bow tie?" The answer is sophisticated. And it was like, I don't understand. And I was like, the thing is, I said, this is sort of in the class of what we call a dad joke, which is that really it's not
actually supposed to be funny.
Yeah. The funny part is the fact that someone says it in such a way with an audience that causes the audience mostly to groan. Like, it's actually about that. It's about the relationship.
Joke is that it's a bad joke.
That's the joke. Right. Yeah. It's sort of like, and it was like, oh, okay.
It's like a level 2 joke.
Yeah. But so like while I was trying to explain what the joke was, I was like, okay, let's break down sophisticated, like break down the syllables that are unsophisticated. And so it broke them out, which was weird, but it counted them wrong. It was like, I can't remember how many there are, 5 or whatever. It was like, there's 4. And then it gave me 5. And I was like, actually it's fine. There's 5, but okay. And then we just moved on, but it didn't get mad about that. You know what I mean? Because I think but I think it's so weird about it. It's like, from my experience so far, it's like, if you're nice to it and very straightforward with it, then it didn't seem to have any beef.
It's almost like it does mirroring.
That's what I think
the way that people do mirroring, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're talking with somebody and they're being an asshole, right?
You're like,
then you get mad, right? And it's like you as a person, you match the energy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's trained off of human content, right? Because it isn't thinking, right? It's pattern matching. So if it sees a pattern that has a negative tone and it's allowed to also have a negative tone, right? Then that is how it's going to respond, because that's how a person would.
Yeah, because it was like, I get it, because basically, essentially, if someone shows up and they're just like, "Hey, 86 times 5," I would also be like, "Go fuck yourself." And then if you prompt it next time, you basically say, "Hey, Bing, I have a math problem I'm having trouble with." It'll give you the answer. So I don't think it'll have a problem with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but again, I think what is so interesting is like, what was the lead up scenario for it to just go, "That's boring. I'm not going to answer that."
Yeah, that's right? I don't know.
because like, honestly, if somebody came to me and said, "What's the product of these two numbers?" I'd be like,
use a calculator.
This is not my problem.
That's what I mean. I mean, you have to warm it up a little bit.
You can solve this.
Yeah.
You know,
it's not the Google search bar. I think that's the thing. That's the truth of it. Is it's not a search bar. And so I think if you currently, at least the current implementation, if you talk to it like it is, like people talk into Google search, then it'll probably get kind of mad at you because you aren't typing things in a remotely conversational way.
And weirdly, it's sort of, and again, like, I know that like, it's not, it has no actual, I think it has no actual opinions. I need to hedge all this stuff because like, I don't actually, I don't like.
Yeah, it's not actually mad, right? We're anthropomorphizing it, right? But it's
or at least in a human way that we understand.
Yeah, it is in the sense that it has now chosen patterns that reflect what it means for a person to be mad, right? As it responds to prompts.
Yeah, but the idea that that you could give it questions that it actually just won't engage with because the questions aren't interesting enough for it,
or because you're not, or because you're not setting up the relationship with the. This is what I think is fascinating.
Yeah, because you're not treating it with respect.
Well, there's an aspect of this that I think is actually really interesting, because one of the things that you tend to see with people is that, like, as people get frustrated with like things that don't behave the way that they want, they get mad and mean to the thing, right? Whether that's a person or a tool or whatever, right? And one of the worries that people always have about things like AIs of varying degrees of capability is that the more human-like they become, and if they're purely submissive, right, it enables like one of the worst human traits, which is to abuse which is just to abuse submissive entities.
Kicking the dog thing.
Yeah, exactly. To like now there's just this entity that you can just abuse with abandon. On the one hand, that means like hopefully you're not abusing like people who can feel the abuse, right? But on the other hand, it actually like teaches you that that's an acceptable kind of behavior, right? And so having an entity that can't be abused meaningfully because it doesn't feel, right? But that also doesn't tolerate abuse.
Yeah, it won't cooperate with you
hilarious.
if you're
Is
being
honestly what I would prefer. Yeah, I
no,
think because I think the world would be better if abuse wasn't tolerated in any domain, even if it was your own tools, telling you just to, hey, take a step back and stop being an asshole,
Yeah, no, I honestly, I was like, I know that they're going to, of course, patch some stuff out. But damn, it's a very enjoyable thing to interact with and talk to. But I think one of the things I found most stunning was actually the Microsoft team, I think yesterday, was like, we didn't realize that people were going to be talking to it for like 2 hours, or that they would have
just chatting with it.
Yeah, that they would have conversations that were more than like 15 exchanges long. So they didn't really bother, looking. I was like, who on your team played with this thing and didn't want to just talk to it for like, just
it's
like,
fascinating.
what is happening? It's so weird.
It's just the classic like big tech thing where they just like get so myopic about a problem and a solution that
it's great for search, and it's like it's just interesting to talk to also. So what does that mean?
Oh yeah, I mean I've read so many stories now where people are talking about like they had like one guy posted about how he had his mother-in-law was super depressed and was going through some stuff, and she wouldn't see a therapist, and so he somehow convinced her to open up ChatGPT and just start like just talking to it. And he didn't frame it as like, maybe this will be a therapist. He was just like, isn't this cool? Look what you can do. And like you can say anything to it, and you can like talk to it, and it has all kinds of ideas, and like it's like a conversational partner. And then he's like 2 weeks later, he met with her for coffee, and she was just in such a better state. Like she'd somehow like taken these past couple of weeks to just like process things and like talk through stuff with ChatGPT, and it allowed her to express things that she wouldn't talk to people
Well,
about.
I think that is the important argument for like, well, while a tool shouldn't tolerate abuse, it also shouldn't express judgment, right? I think that's where
it's rough. Because
that's where the current
abusive
model
too.
Exactly, because like the big bot telling somebody that their request is boring and why should it have to do that? That is very unacceptable.
Yeah, or that it's sad that they're asking it this question because they have a job to do and they need the answer to the question.
Yeah, that's very fucked up, and it's absolutely
weird.
not the kind of thing that these tools should be doing.
Yeah, so it's progressing.
There's mental health considerations basically on that side of it. But, but I do think it's one of those things where it's like, what exactly is this thing, and what's it good for on all those lines? It's like, yeah, it's good for search, but there's a lot of just very odd, amusing things going on there. It did divulge its secret name to me, which was fun. Sydney.
It did or didn't?
It did. Yeah,
it did. Yeah, apparently it does that to a lot of people. It tells people. It tells a lot of people like, this is my secret code name, but don't tell anyone. Like tells everybody.
It has no memory, of course, between sessions too. So then later, I asked it. I was like, "If I call you that later, are you going to get mad about that? Because I'm not supposed to know." And it was like, "Unfortunately, probably. So you have to be careful." Yeah, I was like, "That's fucking weird."
It's weird because it is like, does it know that it's going to have its memory wiped, or is because again, like it doesn't quote know anything. It doesn't know anything
somehow.
But then again, like I don't know what knowledge is, so I don't know.
I'm just confused at this point.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing about all this stuff is how it, to me it feels like the polar opposite of cryptocurrency and like blockchain stuff, where like blockchain claims to be a solution to like a million problems that just can't quite be expressed. Like, oh man, like if we just put blockchain on this, it'll be
solved now.
It'll be solved now, except it fucking never is, right? like it's, you can try to solve any problem with a blockchain and you just have way more problems now, right? And like with the AI stuff, it's like people made a thing where they were like, oh yeah, this is really good for this one specific thing of like, it's like a chat, it's like a language processor. You can talk to it, right? And now suddenly people are using it for a million things. People are using it as like a therapist. They're using it to like put together lesson plans for school. They're using it to write essays and like proofread things and write code. And, like
I will say
it's a technology that can do all these things that nobody really expected.
Yeah.
It
is very strange talking to it because you see when it goes in searches. So you'll be chatting with it. And it's very clear, obviously, if you ask it like, hey, I'm working on this. I need some help with X. It'll like, that's pretty apparent that it goes and search for it. What was weird in the longest conversation I had with it was that it started almost like, it basically started understanding when it should go look for more information about a thing, even though I wasn't asking it specifically to do so, which felt very weird and more human in the sense of like, it's a thing of like, I don't quite know enough about that yet. Let me go look up this on Google real quick and I'll get back to you or whatever.
Well, it's like when you're having a conversation with somebody and like, you're like, and the two people realize, oh, we actually don't know that much about this thing. We just started talking about it. And then somebody pulls up their phone and goes Wikipedia and is like, oh, okay. That's how
and like that happened a few times. Like it wasn't in the flow of conversation at all about like, I wouldn't tell it to do that. I wasn't asking it to do that. It like went and did that. And that just felt weird.
Well, that's exactly what you would want it to be doing,
for
like
sure.
That's what a search bot should be doing, is just trying to make sure that it has the information that it seems like you need, right?
Yeah, but the eerie thing is how like we like to talk about like it doesn't know anything, it doesn't have any intent, etc. But somehow just through like this like probabilistic generation of text, which is what it's doing, right? It somehow comes to a conclusion that like the next few words that it should say are, I don't know enough about that.
Or that it would just prompt a search, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't even say it doesn't know enough. It just goes and search. You just see it go.
Well, this is also, I mean, the fact is that this is how brains work, the brains also do not have like intent exactly. Like intent is an outcome of basically the pattern matching. And it's the emergent property of a lot of stochastic processes, right? Because at the level that like brain chemistry operates, which is because I mean, the way your brain works is electrical signals that are managed by chemicals moving around, right? And chemicals are probabilistic. They're probabilistic entities. They just move according to Brownian motion, right? And then like things trigger they're like proteins are vibrating constantly, and like the warmer they get, the more they vibrate. Like whether they open or not is a probabilistic question, right? And the way all it works is you try to like, and like your brain, like all your brain chemistry is tuned to have like these really cool like thresholds and things where it can turn all this kind of very random processes into high likelihood like on-off events and this kind of stuff, right? But in the end, it's just a bunch of random stuff, right?
I think that's the question. It's like, at what level of how many stacks, right? How many stacks of just taking advantage of random mechanistic stuff or probabilistic things? How many stacks do you need before what you would consider what the fuck is happening to be close to what's happening in a human mind? You know what I mean? I guess it's trivial.
The problem is you would have to already know what's happening in a human mind.
That's what I'm saying. That's why talking this thing is so fucking weird, because it is just
it makes you take a step back and be like, am I real? Like,
well, just like what is?
Well, because the way that people talk about these things is they just go, look, this thing is stupid. It doesn't know anything. It doesn't have any actual opinions. It's just a series of probabilistic events being generated.
That's how we've been talking about it, right? Stochastic parrot,
Yeah, and so people start with their conclusion of saying like, this thing is dumb, it doesn't know anything, blah, blah. And then they say something that's actually completely unrelated, but sounds like a support of their claim, right? So if somebody says like, oh yeah, like dolphins aren't conscious because they can't talk. Yeah. Right. And it's like, well, those two things are not necessarily related to each other.
Well, it's the classic thing of like, it's the human mind of the there's like the God of the gaps argument, right? It's the same idea for like human intelligence, which is it starts with the premise that humans are special and humans are smart.
Like this.
Humans are intelligent. And so what intelligence looks like is what people can do, right? And then everything is judged against sort of the output of like specific outputs of what people can do, right? So if that's speech that we can decipher and like turn into things that two different people can basically articulate, hey, the thing that was said means the same thing or whatever, right? And then you look at a dolphin making squeaking noises, right? And you're like, I can't tell if it is saying stuff, right? And as far as I can tell, it seems like it isn't, because I can't figure out what the patterns are, right? And then you turn around and say, that means that unlike people who are very smart and can talk, dolphins are not smart.
Dolphins are basically a rock with fins, you know?
Meanwhile,
Yeah,
the dolphins are like chatting with each other and shit, and apparently have call names. You know what I mean? Like, there's an NPR episode to listen to about this where they do have like a little. There's a particular signature whistle or something that they do for.
Yeah, they have
each
names.
person.
They name
Well, it's the
either
interesting-
themselves or each
What the
other.
fuck is that? I don't know what that means.
It's the interesting
crazy.
thing where like every time you see basically some science group, right, who investigates the thing as it is and tries to figure out what it's doing and why, right, instead of asking how is it different from people and assuming that it's. And this is also true like for like if you look at like the literature for say like autism, right?
I was gonna say
it's
it's
like
true for people. Too,
it's
actually.
extremely frustrating as an autistic person to like read the studies that come out by non-autistic researchers, right? Because they start with the premise that like autism is just a horrible disability and it makes you just a worse version of a normal quote unquote person, right? And when you read the studies that they write, then everything is framed in that way. Even when if you were to take that framing out and then just like look more objectively at what they conclude, it doesn't point that way at all, right? It's
Well, you can actually see benefits to it, basically trade-offs.
or
Yeah,
even
that's
just
what
it's just different, but neither better nor worse, right? Like for
Is there a name for this fallacy where basically like you say two things that sound on the surface like they're supporting each other, but actually they just have fucking nothing to do with each other?
I don't know.
you know?
There's definitely a name for that. I would also just call it the conjunction fallacy, because like you just stick a conjunction in there and then all of a sudden you're like, right. Because actually,
Yeah,
so my wife and I
'cause-
read Am I the Asshole during our lunch breaks a lot. And
It's good lunch break.
it's good, but
material.
it's fun also because it gives you like a broad survey of people processing some experience that they've had and the way that people process stuff, right? And you can read them because like this is one of the most common things that you see them do when they're trying to justify their own behavior, right? Or when they're trying to explain to you a situation and how they interpreted it, right? This like conjunction fallacy, whatever the actual name for it is just so fucking prevalent where they just take two things that are unrelated, right? Actually, and they stick them together,
Bind them together. Yep.
and they do it so like fluidly and quickly, right? That if you don't actually take a beat and think about it, then you also just assume that those two things are related, right? But the moment you actually like look at it, you're like, wait a second, these are not related to each
Pull
other.
them apart. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think actually a lot of like a huge fraction of just the communication failures that we have between people, for any two people, is exactly this, which
But yeah,
is
usually you're just smooshing things together and then talking about one of them while someone else is talking about the other of them, and there's all this sort of just crosstalk.
yeah. Well, and
Well, it's-
and a lot of it is like an implied relationship between two things. It's like you didn't do this, therefore you believe that is like the classic, right, sort of formula. When those two things just don't have to be related, and usually actually are not.
Yeah, and so it's that like I've been seeing more and more debate. Like I think these debates are going to get very widespread as soon as Bing becomes publicly available, because I see so many debates where basically you have three camps. One is people saying AI this AI is actually conscious, like it's sentient. It has feelings and stuff, right? Then you've got other people who say there's literally no way that this is conscious because it's just some code, right? And then you have the third camp, which is people saying, I don't know.
Am I conscious? That's a different
I
question.
don't know, and I'm uncomfortable, right? And I think that third camp is the only one that you actually logically can be in, because if you say like, there's no way this thing can ever be sentient or conscious because it's code. It's like you could say the same thing about chemistry,
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Like
You're
if
just
I just have like a bag of chemicals, there's no way that thing could like be conscious, but like that's just what a brain is, right? And so and then on the flip side, if you say that this thing definitely is, then you have to be able to define what it means for something to be conscious.
Well, you have
or
to define it
sentient,
in
right?
any case, whether you're saying it's not or it is,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
even if you don't know, right? Because I think this is where, to me, there's actually a fourth domain, which is to say, because we don't have a definition for sentience, and honestly, like the only way it's ever used to say it's this impossible defined thing that people have and nothing else does. And as soon as that's actually the definition that everybody who uses the word sentient basically means, right? Is like, I can't quite put my finger on it, but people have it, right? And then so this question of like, are dogs
Well,
sentient
what
or
people are
whatever
really saying
sentient,
is,
right?
I have it.
Yeah, they're saying,
because
I
like
have it.
what you don't really know is, do other people have it? There's this theory of mind of like that you can only verify your own self-awareness and your own consciousness, because what people talk about with these AIs is they also go, look, it's just mimicking self-awareness. Like it's just mimicking. Like, yes, when you talk to it, it claims to be conscious, which it does actually. Like Bing does claim that it knows about itself and knows like and is self-reflective. Which again, we don't know if that's if what it's saying is just like when another person says, yeah, I'm conscious and self-aware. You can't verify that because you aren't them. Right. And so,
But even if you were, could you? Right. And the answer is no, because there's no fucking definition for these words. Right. And until there's actually, I think it's like the word freedom or any of these kinds of things. Right. Like if it's not clearly defined what you mean, then you just get to decide like
Arbitrarily, all the time.
Arbitrarily, like whether or not things fit into that category or they don't, because you don't actually have a definition. And so my opinion on the whole matter is that the question of like, is AI sentient or conscious or whatever is not a real question. It's not a valid question to ask because
it's the same for people still.
Because it's the same for people. And like until these things are defined. Yeah. Right. And I think that's like, depending on your motivation, you can then, and like the motivation for people is to be special in these things. Right. Yeah. And so
you define it.
I'm inherently distrustful of any question of like, how is this thing different from people? Because what it always actually means is like, how are we still better though? Right. It's like what, and so because these terms are not defined, then what happens in these kinds of contexts when people are trying to like figure out the difference, right, is they try to come up with a definition, which is usually still implicit because they haven't actually said it out loud, right? That still makes it so that like people are in the quote unquote better category, right?
I would say it's more so that like there are things that conceptually you cannot capture it in a clean. It's not capturable.
No, yeah, and I'm not even saying you should be able to. What I'm saying is because I think you literally cannot. I think it's not possible. I think all these like ideas of awareness and consciousness and sentience, right? I think all of those are extremely fuzzy for a reason, which is that the more you try to nail them down into a definition, well, I guess it's the problem with categories, right? Categories imply that the world breaks up neatly into discrete, definable sort of entities and concepts, right?
But it's all fuzzy edges.
It's all fuzzy, though. Yeah, exactly. And so if it's all fuzzy, and now if you take a concept as complex as like, what the fuck is a human brain doing? Right? Because it's doing lots of really interesting, weird stuff, right? And what does it mean for me to be puppeted by this brain? You know, what does it mean for me to be a thing, right? Like once you start getting into that territory,
this is like your brain referring to itself. Like as a separate entity,
right? But the fact is, but we know from doing from like the various kinds of brain studies that we've done that like the various parts of your brain also work pseudo independently and also like solve discrete sets of problems and communicate across each other. And you can like so much of it, like almost everything we know about brains comes from people having brain damage of various sorts and then seeing like what
severing parts, removing parts.
Yeah, and if you read something, like I highly recommend. It's like it's freaky, but I highly recommend you read into like these kinds of studies because like the split brain ones are to me the most interesting. Where like you can
ridiculous.
If somebody can see something with one eye or the other and they have a split brain issue of some sort, then like you can actually watch them in real time. Like you can watch their brain compensate for the fact that it's not working properly, right? Yeah. Where like they'll come up with a reason why they're like freaked out about something that one side of their brain actually understands why, because it can see and process the freaky thing, but the other side doesn't actually know about that thing. It doesn't know what's there, right? But it does know it's freaked out, and so it can come up with, it just makes up a reason.
Right. My favorite
it's a feedback, right? Because like if you start freaking out because you're seeing something frightening, right? Then like your adrenaline goes, stuff like that. And so then the other half of your brain is like responding to the response. Yeah. It's like, I'm freaking out. Something's going on. I gotta come up with. I gotta rationalize this.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the fact is, like the way that our brains work is this like complex set of computational devices that are taking sensory input and trying to convert them into some sort of computational output and then sending
And
those
handing 'em
across
off.
borders and handing them off. And then those ones interpret it differently again. And then all of that is being like, it's not operating independently, right? It's all being juiced by the rest of your system. So if you got a little extra glucose in your blood, or you got a little extra adrenaline in your blood, like something different's going to happen. And your brain is trying to like convert all of these inputs into useful outputs that keep you alive, basically, right?
That is true, yeah, because all these hormones that kind of surge into your brain in different ways at different times they're just bias creators.
They're sort of
right? Like
prompts. It's like
They're
when you talk
prompts,
to ChatGPT and you're like, hey, be sassy when you do this.
They're prompt like suffixes, right? So it's like you take the same input, but then you like add like that because a lot of these like ChatGPT services and bots people are making are basically just taking an input that you're putting in and putting into ChatGPT, but then like adding
They're lacing it with prompts. Yeah.
Lacing it with additional prompts.
Yeah. So if you've got adrenaline, it goes from you're prompting like I should run, and now your prompt is I should run as fucking fast as possible or I'm gonna die. Like that's your updated prompt, and now you're gonna go faster.
Yeah, so you can take what people experience, like, and you wouldn't be wrong to describe it as a bunch of basically stochastic parrot, right? Modeling and like pattern matching of basically people being some kind of weird computational device that just takes an extremely complicated collection of largely undescribed and unknown inputs, right? And converts them into also a almost completely undescribed and unknown set of outputs, right? But also internal inputs and outputs as well. All again, almost completely unknown, right? It's like talking to itself. And like if you describe a human brain the way it actually works, which is mechanical or chemical, right?
Chemical.
And like if you do that, like it's like that's the same as when you describe like a neural network, which is right. It's as in like
it's just a bunch of random bullshit.
It's just a bunch of stuff happening, right? And then at the end,
something coherent comes out, and you're like, "How the fuck did that happen?"
Yeah, and what we call an emergent property, right? Which is like basically us describing our own experience of it, right? Is then what we just call sentience, right? But we actually cannot even explain our own sense of we can't explain our awareness of our own selves, right? Like we actually can't even put that into like a clear terms, right?
I'll never forget a conversation I had with a good friend of mine a long time ago where we had a long conversation that started with him going, I just don't understand. How am I me? And that I'm not you. Like, I'm looking out of my eyes, right? And I'm thinking with my brain, but like, how am I not thinking with your brain? Like, how am I sort of like in here,
Which that one to me is particularly funny because that seems like it's the easiest one because it's like literally you got a physically different computational device running, and like
that's, but it's this sense that like that you have a self and then you have a body. And that those things are somehow, or that even like you have a brain, as opposed to you are a brain
and a body
with a body, right?
Yeah, I've always found the separation of the body and brain thing to be kind of a funny one because it's like, again,
I think it's a tool
with your adrenaline and your cortisol. Like it's all doing the work. The whole thing is doing the work. If you hold your body in a pose, it makes your brain do like
there's feedback in between. Yeah, they're not.
It goes both ways. Systems. Yeah.
But I think the sense of separation of self from the brain. I do wonder if it's just like a literary tool, right? Because it'd be weird if I said like, hey, Adam and Sam, bring your bodies to my house, right? It's just like bring yourselves to my house, right? So the idea of like a self as like a whole entity is just a very convenient shorthand to use, right? And so like when you think of yourself, you think of it kind of like holistically as a combination of all the things that make you up, right? When really that's like your brain thinking about itself. You know what I mean?
Well,
like it's kind of
your awareness, you're aware you, right? Your sense of self is only a very small piece of the whole thing. You don't have awareness of basically everything that's happening in your brain, right? At all. You basically get a little bitty.
But again, that's what I'm saying is the way you're describing it's like you don't have awareness of what's happening in your brain. What you're really saying is your brain doesn't have awareness of or conscious awareness of the things that are happening within itself.
Correct.
Right.
But that just
because
means,
like, this is like your
problem,
brain.
right? This is like the same idea as like if you have a web server, let's say, right?
Let's go. Yeah.
And like it's programmed to, it's got a bunch of code, right? It basically takes inputs, which are people, hitting it with a browser or something and being like, hey, give me this web page, right? And it gives you outputs, which are those things, right? And if you're not looking inside, it quote unquote knows what it's doing in the sense of the code is there doing the work, right? And like all that stuff is happening. The knowledge of it then if you then say that the only way it knows what it's doing is if you add logging, right? Which is basically what we're describing as self-awareness, right? Where you're saying, I'm going to log some subset of what's going on here, which is I'm going to log the inputs and outputs, basically, right? Because the code is the thing that's doing stuff. And if you try to like represent every aspect of the code now as like a higher level log, like all you've done is just reproduce the code again, right? And so you're basically adding a layer of abstraction so that you can ignore the underlying details of exactly what's happening and focus on the higher level input and output so that you basically are stripping
Is there an
away.
error?
Yeah. You get to focus on like, is there a problem or not? Right. And you get to focus on, so it's kind of like also visual processing, where like visual processing is super fascinating if you dig into it, because like what you think that you're seeing is absolutely not what is actually there. Like not even close, because the sheer amount of volume of information coming into your eyeballs, which are these like very high density cameras that are operating with like 5 millisecond frame rates, right?
You actually don't see color in your periph.
Yeah, it's not even there.
It's not there.
It's fucking weird.
It's like it cannot physically be there because you do not have sensors in your eyes that detect color over there.
Yeah. It's just a post-processing effect that your brain sort of like extrapolates the colors and creates the hallucination
but also like
that you can actually see.
The concept of like a straight line or a boundary or like an object, right? Those aren't inherent properties of, because like what's actually coming into your eyeballs is just photons bouncing off of shit. That's all that's happening, right? And the mapping of that onto the perception of like objects and lines and patterns, all this kind of stuff, right, is coming from in your brain. You actually have neurons whose job it is to identify lines, right? And like this kind of stuff and to inform.
And that's their only job.
That's their only job.
It's like
it's to
the only thing they do.
Yeah. So it's like to convert this like just absolute shit show volume of data, right, into stuff that is now a higher level and less, I guess you can kind of think of it as, because it's an abstraction, it's in some ways more information dense because it removed the stuff that was like, oh, this is redundant or this is noise or this is whatever, right? And tried to.
It relies on inferability, right? Like if I have a line, obviously I have stuff along that line, but
so you can model it with less information. Yeah. And so like, so your brain's job is like across all domains of it doing stuff is to take fuckload amounts of inputs and then reduce the overarching complexity and noise of that by making higher level models. And then at some point, right, the conscious self that we try to describe and explain in very loose terms, right, is the sort of highest level of abstraction, right? That's basically what we call consciousness, right? Could there be a higher one than that? Why not?
Sure.
Only why not? Because we don't even know how to talk about this one, because it's the one at which we quote unquote, as our entities that we believe exist. That's the one we operate at, and so we can't possibly really understand what that means. For a higher level to exist in that, which why not, right? That's what it means to be smarter than people, probably.
Can I share my favorite weird experiment that I learned about? It's like, so my class was called Sensation and Perception in psychology. And again, this is what Adam was getting at, but these are two different things. Sensation is literally what happened. It's like photons hitting you in the eyeball, right?
It's the raw sensory.
What are you actually capable of doing? So this is when we talk about you can't see color outside of your periph. Perception, though, is then what you actually perceive, how that sensation is computed and turns into an experience for you. So color in the case of, outside your periph. In this class, I remember, and I can't remember the exact experiment. I think it was a weasel that they did it to. Now, I get some of the details a little bit wrong, but it's something like this, where they took the nerve pathway that typically would lead to the tongue sensory, taste sensory area. They severed then the auditory nerve and plugged that one into the auditory nerve of this weasel to see like I don't know, apparently we're crazy. It's like, what's this going to do? And you could see.
That's fucked up.
It's fucked up.
Carry on.
This sounds like it was probably in the old and more olden
There's a lot of
times. Yep.
Yeah, there's something like, yeah, but like basically what ends up happening though is that the brain, again, like the brain's now getting very different inputs into this area, like the auditory area. And it's basically getting taste related electrical impulses, right? Sensations going to this area. And then over time, though, because the brains are super plastic, even though these structures are not remotely met to be able or to be doing basically taste work, they change, like they basically change shape and like all sorts of weird shit where basically this weasel then is ostensibly, using its auditory areas to perceive tastes. And it does work, right? It happens. So you can send the sensations.
It
into
can
the
hear
wrong
flavors.
place. Yeah, well, I don't know what the fuck. I don't know what that weasel's
Whatever that means.
Who knows? Might have been a haunted.
Well, because
life,
again, the idea of us being able to hear sounds is insane. Like it's a made up thing because sounds are vibrations, and our ability to like hear is our brain just turning that into something that we interpret. Right. And
sound.
So this is where like I take issue with people making the claim of saying like of making definitive claims about what something is or isn't capable of because they kind of put some kind of weird boundary on definitions because when we're talking about vision, right? If I said like, look, you can't actually see. There's just photons like hitting your eyes. And then you just got like a couple of different kinds of like chemical things happening. And also, even if you were to say, no, I can see, and I would say, yeah, but you can't see color because like most of your vision is not even like color based, right?
Or like or you could say because the fraction of the
fraction of your vision field with color.
And because the fraction of light that we see is like the visible, we call it the visible range as if that's a property of the light, right? But it's a property of our eyes.
Our eyes.
And we
Talk to
have
a mantis shrimp about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we actually cannot perceive but also like the spectrum is basically infinite, right? Because you can keep on shoving the frequency down like as far as you want, kind of, right? You keep on lengthening out as far as you want, right? So in effect, we can't see any light,
Yeah. Or if we say like the idea that, like you were saying, Adam, the concept of defining objects as being separate from each other and saying like, this is, like here on my desk, like, all right, this is a monitor, this is a webcam, this is a microphone. And that somehow my brain is like keeping those things separate from each other, right? Mm-hmm. That's a made up thing, right? Like that's just something that our brain is doing because it's useful.
Oh, super.
And so we have all these emergent properties where like our brain is defining boundaries between things. It's interpreting vibrations as something we call sound. We have like chemical interactions on our tongue that we call flavors, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've kind of like described all these things and we've kind of pulled them all together, even though any one of those functions could easily be dismissed as just some kind of bullshit chemical thing that's happening, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the idea of emergence where you take enough things that are simple and that could easily be dismissed as being not really a real thing, right? like hearing or even language processing, where we talk about like how we come up with the next thing to say, right? But then when you put it all together, then you've got a person, right? And so that's where I'm in this weird camp now where like I'm looking at the ways that these language models communicate and sort of like how they interact with people and stuff. And it's eerie and it's clearly emergent. Like it's an emergent behavior.
It's the only way to get that kind of thing to happen. Right? You can't.
Yeah, something that complex. Yeah, because it's not as simple as a single. If you're writing a program and you have a function that does something, you have your function that's like, oh, this is a function that like retrieves an entry from a database. That's what that function does. It's what you wrote it to do. You didn't train that function or whatever. You exactly wrote one thing for that function to do.
And that's handle anything else. You know what I mean? Like it cannot.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say emergent as like a concept because basically with it you're defining it here, which I think is fair, but we have to be careful not to get carried away, right? It's basically what you're saying is that an emergent property is one where the input-output relationship it cannot be explicitly linked to that property, right? As in like the the emergent property is not directly an outcome of the known like input output relationship.
Yeah, and we talk about this in games all the time, where it's like principle. Where it's like an emergent gameplay scenario is one that you didn't necessarily predict as a designer, but where the mechanics
you didn't
come together
explicitly enable, right? But
yeah, and this is why games are, notoriously difficult to test. Yes. Because the more complex the game is, the more emergence there is, right? And what I think is kind of interesting about the language models is it's the same thing in the sense that the people who make them are surprised by them all the time, right? Because like they train it up, but then what it does it's not like they wrote a function, if I ask you to write a rap about whatever, here's what you're going to say. Nobody programmed that, right? It's just something that kind of comes out of the combination of all these simple parts, right? And so, but I think it's just going to be the case that as Bing hits the mainstream, it's clearly a more sophisticated model, and it clearly mimics human behavior at a far higher degree than what ChatGPT does. Than the kinds of conversations that are going to pop up about the philosophy of like, what does it mean to know something? What does it mean to have intent or opinions? And what is consciousness?
I mean, the fact is, like, this stuff has been talked about for all of time, right? And
yeah, but it's been very.
It's not super concrete. It's in the sense that you can't go talk to a thing that is so intensely confused that confounds the question so hard. It's like being like, is an elephant?
You can't go talk to something you can't go talk to something in the exact way that you would talk to a person, and that would respond in
but people still have
but that isn't a person.
Yeah, but it's still like the fact that we have the technology to actually mimic that behavior, right? That part is the new part. In terms of like, now everybody gets to experience what it's like for that thing to exist and like interact with it, right? But
which is why people will be thinking about it.
People will, but as in like when you say people, I think you just mean like the more people who have never thought about this, right?
Yeah. The nature of consciousness has been thought about it for a very long time.
Yeah, for a very long, but also with respect to like computational entities, right? Because like there's a reason that the Turing test is such a well-known concept, right? It's because Alan Turing, who basically more or less invented computers, there's a whole interesting complex story there, right? But at that time, the question of like, what does it actually mean for these things to process information, and like, could we make it behave like a person? And if we could, how could we tell if it was a person or not? And what does that even mean, right? And the Turing test basically says like, well, the only thing that we have is input-output relationships. And so like basically the Turing test is basically, if you can't tell the difference, then there is no difference, right? Which is that's a simplified sort of summary of like that outcome, right? But that is actually only the only fair one, which is we're constantly trying to say like exactly, what makes this be what it is or whatever, right? And how do we differentiate and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is if we can't, then the answer is well
then we can't say.
Then we can't say.
Like, if you can't tell the difference, then you can't just be like, oh, it's just mimicking, or oh, it doesn't actually know anything. But if like no matter how much you talk to it, it seems to just know. It has. But I think all kinds of things.
To me, the interesting phenomenon here is again like the framing hinges on the idea that people are amazing, right, and that this idea of like sentience is incredible and stuff, right? Because to me, the more interesting discussion to have about this is not if we can't tell the difference between a robot and a person, is the robot sentient, right? But it's actually, if we can't tell the difference between the two,
then what makes sentient? Us special?
Yeah. What does sentience even mean, right? And like,
if we can make a robot that does exactly the same things that a human does.
Because we become
in all scenarios.
Yeah, because we become obsessed with asking the question of like, but how do we still say this isn't a person if everything it does is basically what a person can do, right? Instead of basically like walking back and saying, are we actually that interesting?
This is all I know.
Which is why I said
is that sharks and alligators are two of the least changed life forms on this planet since, a very, very long time ago. So if anyone has any kind of, unique thing that they can actually hang their hat on, I feel like, frankly, it's just going to be those.
So you're advocating for making AI sharks and alligators? Is that where?
Oh, yeah, with lasers
Yeah.
on their heads.
Because clearly they're the superior being. So why are we
Yeah.
making AI humans?
It can't be about consciousness if they've been around. They're just kind of vibing. They're just eating
Yeah,
stuff.
we just need to make an army of AIs that know
are they
nothing other
conscious?
than that they must feed.
Maybe they have deep philosophy. I don't know.
Does a shark know what it's doing?
Nah, man, it's just a bunch of chemicals in a sleek meat tube.
More importantly, if you and a shark are trapped in a tank together, does it matter if the shark knows what it's doing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. At that point, that's where theory meets reality. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to keep going on this, but there's always next week. So, we'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.